Hey there everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the definition of an object in Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology, as well as looking at the terms undermining and overmining, which he develops as two problematic ways to approach ontology that object-oriented ontology is going to surmount. So in so doing, we'll get some clarification on why Harman thinks his project is so important and some of the ways that it defies some of the troubled steps that other philosophers may have taken. This is going to be adding on to the work that I've already done regarding the term flat ontology, which he also develops in this work, and will help kind of gain some clarity on what exactly this work is about, because I don't see much stuff on YouTube about this. Now, Harman makes clear very early on in the work that when he talks about objects, he's not talking about objects in the sense that a materialist ontology would talk about objects. These sort of purely corporeal, material things. That, for him, is too narrow of a definition of object. And as I spoke of in the last lecture, it might actually be more helpful in terms of understanding the connotations and the wideness of his definition of objects to think of the term entities. Entities is about the most ontologically neutral and wide-ranging term that we have, right? An entity could be an entity like a book or a person. It could be an institution. It could be a trend. It could be a fictional character, could be a concept. All of these could be considered entities in their own right. And what Harman is trying to do is trying to find a way to look at objects that, like I said in the last lecture, is not going to privilege nature, and it's also not going to privilege human constructions. So it's going to find a way to take into account the material nature of reality while also taking into account the relational aspects of reality. Therefore, he defines an object as something which is reducible neither to its components nor to its effects on other things, which is to say, its relations. He says that an object is, quote, anything that has a surplus beyond its constituent pieces and beneath its sum total effects on the world. In order to explicate what these trends are, this sort of middle ground that he's trying to straddle, he talks about two trends in ontology, that being undermining and overmining. Now, undermining is when we reduce an object to just its mere components. The sort of thing that we normally see, for example, that is a representation, something like a book that appears to us as an object. In fact, for an underminer, this is only a surface level version of the more primordial underlying truth that is its components. So there is an obfuscation of the value ontologically of the object as it appears to us, and instead it's sort of a smoke and mirrors version of what is really real, which is the components. And of course, if you watch the last lecture about flat ontology, you know that he doesn't really find this very convincing because we're just arbitrarily privileging a certain level of our ontology. He calls undermining a form of smallism, where that which is large needs to be broken down into its components. And he links this to, for example, a scientific way of trying to understand reality, where humans can be understood, of course, in a very different way, if we look at their chemical composition, if we look at the molecular basis for behaviors and ways of being. But of course, we only get one way of understanding ontology, and one that Harman doesn't want to say is more or less valuable. If I understand myself as a collection of chemical and atomic components, I indeed get a very novel and helpful understanding of my body. I can better micromanage my responses to stimuli, and I can understand the underlying bases for things that might seem fairly enigmatic, like diseases. But that approach isn't going to get us very far when it comes to, for example, understanding cultural practices. You can only get so far with a purely materialist understanding of practices, partially because this materialist undermining perspective seeks to make objects simple by going to the small level where we can look at individual deterministic relations. Whereas if we look at relational things like societies, concepts, fictional characters, these don't necessarily act deterministically, right? Like, for example, if I am a masculine entity, if that is something that defines me, that masculinity is not really defined by my components. If it was, then taking out any one component of me, for example, chopping off a finger or even just removing an atom, would decrease my masculinity in proportion to the amount of stuff that was just removed from me, which doesn't really make any sense. It's not like it's not like someone who's paraplegic or someone who has lost a limb is suddenly less masculine in proportion to that loss of function. No, not really. Right? Masculinity is a construct of relational terms, of certain ideas of what is acceptable, right? And things like this which do not act deterministically and do not have a one-to-one correspondence to components. So for an underminer, we get the problematic assumption that objects are too shallow to exist. That the human, as we see it right here in the viewfinder, right? This is a shallow version of the underlying truth of what I really am, which is my atoms, my chemicals that make me up, the neurotransmitters going off of my brain, just that stuff. And the problem here is we can't actually account for the emergence of things like identity. So for example, if I am Gavin, according to an underminer's perspective, what I really am is a group of components. And these components all come together to make me. But if this is the case, then removing just one component, like I said earlier, is going to invalidate that identity by effectively making me a new entity, since what defines an entity for an underminer is just its components. So not only can we not account for the emergence of identity, but we cannot account for the constancy of identity across time. Because with time comes change, right? Atoms are replaced from outside and taken into me through the air, through the things I consume. Also, cells just die and then regenerate. So, according to this, I am a new entity at every moment in time because I am a new conglomeration of components. If you think about the way that each of your atoms is vibrating inside your body, never will you find two places in time where every atom is in exactly the same place as it was in point A of time. So undermining is a very reductive way of understanding ontology, of understanding identity, which isn't able to account for emergence or the constancy of identity. Compare this to overmining, which is going to reduce an object solely to its relations. A good example of a philosopher who does this is Michel Foucault. Foucault is famous for coming up with the idea of discourse analysis, which is to say that what it is to be in any way, whether this is being masculine, being criminal, being mad, this is inextricably tied to a discourse which structures what that being is. Meaning, for example, if I am masculine, that means I exist as a function of a discourse of acceptable practices. Things like acceptable ways to dress or speak or interact with one another. And for Foucault, we cannot talk about an objective version of masculinity, for example, because masculinity is by definition relational. It is subject to the contingencies of our historical moment, of our place in the world, the culture that we lie within, and even, our literal place that we take up in space and time. So for Foucault, we cannot talk of an objective, even body, for example, because in Discipline and Punish, Foucault points out how the body, he says, the soul is the prison of the body, where the soul is defined discursively, what it is to be the soul of mankind, right? That this is a created concept which doesn't actually exist behind the institutions and power relations which make that idea exist at all. And of course, the problem here is that it denies any excess or surplus beyond an entity's impact. So for example, we get stuck in the idea of a discourse such that we cannot talk about the bare materiality of the body that goes beyond a system of relations. So for example, it is well and good that the idea of masculinity does not have an objective definition. This is a relational term. But the masculine body is nevertheless an imposed relational function upon a material body, right? And this body exists whether or not you exist in one culture or another. It doesn't matter whether I'm in China or the US, I still have a body, which in some part is not solely accountable to the relations which define my way of being in the world. So what Harman wants to do is try to bridge a gap between both of these, where we acknowledge the materiality of components and also the relationality of concepts, ideas, discourses, things like that. So I hope that this has helped make sense of Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology, a very interesting work in my opinion, although I think it bears, I think Deleuze totally, blows him out of the water. Maybe it's just my personal love of Deleuze that kind of overshadows him. But for example, he makes this distinction between real objects, which would be like corporeal entities, things like this piece of paper. And then you have sensual objects, sensual in the sense of having to do with the senses. So this would be things like fictional characters, like Sherlock Holmes. And he says that, real objects are these corporeal things, and sensuous objects are those which depend on those corporeal things. This is basically Deleuze's differentiation between the actual and the virtual, where, for example, Sherlock Holmes is a virtual thing. It is a virtual object which exists in the mind, but only insofar as there is an actual physical mind there doing the thinking of the object. And it cannot exist independently of this mind which is actively thinking about it. So little things like that, I think, are just like recyclings of other ontologies. So it's not like the most particularly novel take on ontology, but maybe you might find this terminology helpful and the sort of problems that he's trying to skirt around. So that's it for this lecture. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.